The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our MWF webinar this week. My name is Tanya, and I'm the marketing manager over here at Strucksoft. Just before we start, I just want to let you know, for those of you who are new with us today, our principal software, MWF, which stands for Metal Wood Framer, is our automated Revit wall, floor, ceiling, and truss framing software for light gauge steel and also wood modeling. Today, however, our senior technician, Christina, will be walking us through MWF floor engineering and integrations with leading material sizing engines, including BC Calc, Sizer, and Forte. Just before we start, I'd just like to remind everyone at the end of the webinar, we'll be taking a few live questions. To be selected, please press the raise hand button on the control panel, but please also make sure that your computer audio is working correctly. If you'd prefer, you can also ask questions throughout the webinar in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar dashboard. All right, that's it for me. I'm going to hand off to Christina now.
All right, hey everyone, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. So for today, since we are going to be covering mainly the engineering for the floor portion in lumber, so those three engines that Tanya mentioned, BC Calc, Forte, and Sizer, I thought we'd start off with basically the setup that you do before actually going ahead and engineering the floors. So we're going to take a big floor panel like this, split it up, turn it into panels. We'll review some options in the panel's properties on how to get it properly set up, what your options are if you want to make openings right off the bat, and how to modify those openings. And then we're finally going to take a look at the analysis portion and just give a nice overview on all three engines that we have with the software. So let's start off with kind of a relatively large floor, something you'd obviously want to break into different panels. And the first thing that we're going to cover is just the option to actually split these floors. So there are two options that you can go about it. You can obviously break the floors with Revit, turn this into individual floor elements, but what you can also use is our floor cutter tool. So this was created as a workaround, so you don't have to go through Revit, and it's super simple. It's just going to use model lines. So it'll just use model lines and place, with the model lines placed on top of the floor over here, it'll just tell exactly the floor where it wants to break. So I'm just going to have a few model lines running through the floor. Maybe let's also add one right here too. And then you just really have to grab your model lines, grab your floor, run the floor cutter, and for the lines as well, as long as it runs completely through the floor, they can pretty much be ran in any type of direction. If you want to break up the floors diagonally, you can really run it any which way. So because we're also going to break this floor down into individual floor objects, you can go ahead and change out the floor types here as well. It'll just preload whatever you have in the model, but I'm going to stick with just my generic floor. And if for any kind of architectural reasons you want to keep the original floor as a whole, you can unselect this. It'll keep the original floor and then underlay separate floor objects. So you can use those to panelize. But I'm going to go ahead and delete my original floor. And then that basically breaks them up into individual selectable objects that I can then go ahead and throw panels into. So I like using the floor cutter quite a bit. It will save you a lot of time for breaking up those floors. So the next things in terms of general setup that I'll just highlight, since we are talking more about analysis today, is when you are running these floor panels, you're just going to want to make sure that you have some kind of supports wherever those joists will run. So I've got walls today. You could put in beams. That will work just fine. Basically, as long as the joists will have some type of support to pick up during analysis. And I know I am supporting them underneath the floor, but if you are realistically running these with hangers, then as long as the floor is connecting into the wall, there's no issues there. So I'm going to grab my floor panels. I'm going to say create so I can panelize all these guys out. And floor creation is a lot like wall creation. It's pretty much the exact same workflow. Select which template you want to use. And the only other button that you can choose to select is this Frame It Now option. So this Frame It Now option will basically automatically populate all of your panels with joists. If you have your template set up, it'll start creating like it would any other panel. It'll throw in the joists, throw in the spacing, and do all that automatically. If you leave that unselected, what it's essentially going to do is just populate the floor with these boundary nodes, with the arrows, and with your label. It's not going to throw in any members yet. So benefit of that might be if you are just starting off building your templates, you want to save a little bit of regen time because you're going to go into the properties anyway to modify what you need to. You can always save yourself that extra checkbox. It'll just kind of create the outlines, and it's not going to populate it with any type of joist just yet. All right, so we have our floors set up, and I'll just highlight a few options that we have to now start modifying these. So everything's split, everything's supported. So for this floor in particular, I've got a bit of a cantilever, and just for the purpose of this webinar, I want to change the direction of my joists so it'll cantilever off of that. So super simple. These arrows over here are basically going to show you your joist direction. So that's what this green arrow is for. It's just showing you which way your joists are running. And the red arrow is actually just the direction of your panel. So in this case, it's running west to east, and my panel is running south to north. So if you ever do want to change the direction, super simple. I'm going to grab my arrow, just use plain Revit rotate. It's going to rotate the arrow for me. And then I just give it a quick regen, and we're good to go. So I'll do that with this guy as well. And typically I know you'd obviously run the joists the shorter length of the floor, but I do just have a nice little beam support set up that I want to use over there. So let's go ahead and rotate this guy. So like I mentioned, you can use walls, but you can also use beams as support. So this will be picked up when we actually go ahead and run the analysis on this floor. All right. So we covered basically the creation. Now let's get into reviewing some of those options in the panel's properties, mainly what you're going to need to start setting it up for analysis. So the main member types that we'll analyze, of course, are the joists. We can analyze opening members as well. So in terms of your actual joists, the analysis is going to pick up the spacing that you have in here. So for family selection, obviously we don't really care about this one, so you can use the generic dimensional number, assign any type of sizing to it, and that will obviously change when we go to the analysis engine. But for the actual spacing, this will be picked up when we go ahead and run analysis. So your first joist offset, again, it's just going to be where your first joist runs according to that red arrow, and then just your regular joist spacing. So that's something that you'd set up first in here through the panels properties. And the only other option I'd probably suggest just to set up right away is to make sure your positioning is set up. So for the positioning, similar to the walls, we're going to probably want this on the structural center line, so it's in the structural layer of our floor. And the only extra step that you can modify if you need to is just to ensure that the center line of your joist runs through the center line of your floor. So you can always shift which way it's aligned in the layer, but this is just to ensure that it's sitting on your supports properly. So before we move on to the analysis portion, I thought we'd cover how to create openings, since that can probably be useful if you do have to analyze a floor with some openings in there. You can always create it with panels already in there, and it's not something that has to be modeled right away. So there's two basic options when it comes to creating these openings. The first option that you can do is actually put it directly in the profile of the floor. So if I edit my boundary, I can actually throw in an opening this way. So there's no actual opening object, it's just part of my floor profile. And we have this update profile button. So this is mainly, again, because of these nodes that we use for the floor. The boundary lines and the nodes are what the panel actually follows. So if the floor changes in shape, if it moves, or if you add in an opening in the profile, you can always go ahead and grab that floor, say update profile. It'll pick up those changes. In this case, it recognizes that I put an opening in there. And I can just regenerate that. And it'll frame out my opening. So that's one way to get the opening in there. The next option that you have as well, my personal preference, is to actually draw it in again with model lines. So these are just plain Revit model lines. Oops. There we go. So as long as you draw in some kind of closed loop from model line, we can highlight this. And then there's an option in the tools to create an opening. So this is actually going to create a physical floor object. So let's go ahead and punch it out. So it does create the actual floor opening cut that you can select, but it's the exact same steps. I can go ahead and regenerate this. and it'll automatically pick up and frame around the opening. So last two options for openings, and then we can move on to the analysis portion. For the openings, to kind of control how your openings are framed out, there's again kind of two basic options with that. It's similar to the walls. We use markers, but it's going to be a lot simpler. In this case, we've got two basic opening types. There's a joist supported option and a rim supported option. So right now on both my openings, I have the joist supported option selected. And what that's going to do basically is add in some headers and some trimmers, and just extend my trimmers to the next joists over. If I want to go ahead and choose the rim supported option, I can grab my little marker there, say change opening type right under here in the tools. And let's grab the rim supported one instead. So what that does instead, it just adds full joists to frame out your opening, and it also adds in those additional headers. So just two different options to frame out the openings. And like the walls with these markers, you can always go ahead and modify the defaults. You can duplicate them, create your own, create as many markers as you need to. And they can always be modified if you wanted to add in double headers, double up the trimmers, or if you wanted to double up your supporting joists. It's all options that you can customize here in the marker. All right. So now let's get into kind of the main reason for this webinar, just to cover the options that we have for analysis. So like I mentioned earlier, there's three basic analysis engines that we can use with the software. BC Calc and Forte come completely integrated. So, excuse me, there's no extra downloads that you'll have to purchase or no other software that you'll really need. Forte will be integrated with our next release, and this will use Forte Web. The other engine that we do have as well for Sizer, this uses their actual desktop plugin. So you download the Sizer application, you just link it to the actual EXE, and that will be able to run the software in the background to analyze the joists. So just to start off, I'm going to cover BC Calc. We'll work through all three modules, but I know I did cover BC Calc a little bit in a previous webinar, but I thought I'd go ahead and just retouch on it today. So we'll look at the first option. There's three basic building codes that you can use for BC Calc. You can create a certain inventory preset depending on the materials that you have access to. And BC Calc again will add in hangers. So it'll use Simpson hangers and model those directly in the floor. So the other thing is that the software itself and the design types, basically the loading that's applied to your floor, is all set up over here. You can create as many design types as you need to. You can modify the deflections. And these are what is going to apply the actual loading to the floor. So let's do something a little different. Let's start off with this floor panel here. I'm going to go ahead and change the design type. It's basically just going to apply a loading type to my floor. And then I can go ahead and run analysis. So the other thing I'll just reiterate, you'll see as I go through the other two engines, workflow-wise, it's exactly the same. You just change your design type to assign your loading, and then we can go ahead and jump straight into analysis. So what it will do initially, and you can kind of see in the background as I move through the groups. For analysis purposes, it basically just breaks up different joists into individual groups. So I've got obviously a sloped panel over here, so every joist is going to be unique. But if you are running it for more of a generic square floor, then all of these joists will be grouped in as one. So for these groups, you have the option to select different products if you want to try that per group. But what I generally select is maybe a few different products, and then I can apply that to all of my different group types. Or if I just want to include all the possible types, I'll say use best analysis. I'll again hit apply to all. And then it'll actually run the analysis and give me all the different product types that I can choose per group. So these are all the available ones that passed. I can get my summary table over here. So if I click on this guy, it'll give me the actual PDF reports. So I've got that extra beam as support, so it'll pick that up in the reports and just give you the overall summary for the supports, the reactions. So this is something that can be produced directly in Revit. And again, with BC Calc, you do have the option to add in these hangers. So I do have some different configurations. So it'll just try and find an appropriate hanger for each type of group. But then once you've selected the hangers, you selected your members, I can say OK. And then it's just going to update the model and regenerate my joists. So I only applied the hanger to the one particular joist type just for show, but it's going to place a placeholder, label out that hanger, so you could always pull out or pull this information into a Revit schedule, pull it into your shop drawings. But the main thing is that it'll engineer, select your elements, and regenerate the floor automatically. So that's BC Calc essentially in a nutshell. The other thing I'll highlight as well, and this can be applied to all the engines, is that if you do have some kind of generic beam support, there is actually a separate function that you can use to analyze that beam as well. So once the floor has been analyzed, it's the exact same steps. I'm just going to include all different types of products. I'll let it run through the analysis, pick which one works the best. And it'll give me some options, and it's all the exact same steps. I can even generate a report for just the beam to get the load summary for that particular beam. And once you choose your product selection, it automatically regenerates that beam as well. So that's BC Calc. So let's go ahead and switch over and cover Forte as well. So if I switch engines and run Forte, it's again pretty similar options. I can specify my building code. It still uses my same general loading options that I have. And let's do something different. Let's try it with this opening member. And I'll also rotate the joists so they run the shorter length. So let's go ahead and change the panel design type. And again, let's go ahead and just run the floor analysis. So with Forte, previously they did have a desktop add-in, so you'd link it in before like you did with Sizer. But they've since released something called Forte Web, so it's entirely online. There's nothing extra to download. And that's where you'll be met with this login over here. So you just use your Forte Web login, make your account, and then from then on, analysis is pretty similar. It breaks it up according to member type or according to groups. So I've got my floor joists here that are my typicals. Those are going to be under one group. And then it just divides the rest under partial joists, my headers, my trimmers. So it'll just analyze those members individually. And again, I can go ahead and kind of customize the products I want to use. And let's maybe just go with some basic TJIs. So I'm going to go ahead and apply these selections to all of my groups. Then I can say OK. And again, just based on the product selection, it will give you a general summary. So it'll actually show all the design results based on, the depth that we picked, the number of plies. And you could always isolate these per group. So you do have a load summary over here. But what is cool about Forte Web is that you can actually go directly to the Forte Web login. And if I go ahead and go look at my files, it'll actually send the design back to Forte Web. So that's what's running the analysis. And you can always click on the project. So this was created about a minute ago. and you'll have all the different design options. So all of my member types are going to be here. And you can get some more information directly from Forte. So if I wanted my overall report, let's say, I can see that it's passed. I get all my design results, my load combinations. So all of that can be seen directly through Forte Web. So this is what's actually running the design. And what is cool is because it's run in silent mode, you can see that on the side to get your reports, but it'll automatically select the members. And then like BC Calc, I'm just going to say OK. It'll update my member types and just change those out in my panel. So now I've actually got my TJIs for all my opening types. And never had to have left Revit. All right. So last design engine for today. Let me just go ahead and switch over to another little project that's already set up for it. But basically for Sizer, again, setup-wise is pretty similar. You select the Sizer, you run it to that path which I showed you. And then they do give different designations to the members. So you have the option of choosing a beam, a floor joist, or a roof joist. And then that'll just go ahead and start filtering out the materials. So you can go so far as to select the material you want to use, the species. If I were to actually pick a material type, it would limit the species and then the grade. And you can set up basically your design defaults directly in here as well. So I can go ahead and pick my different member types. But again, if you don't set up any type of designation, then it'll just use all the available options that it has in the engine. So I've already assigned my design type to this. And then it's pretty much the exact same steps. I go ahead and run my floor analysis. And it's again just broken up into different groups. So I added a small cantilever so you can see a bit of variation, but it's just breaking those up. And then the only other difference between BC Calc, Forte, and Sizer is because this uses a desktop application. You do have the option to leave it in interactive mode, and this will actually launch Sizer. So it'll actually open up the app, and you can go ahead and modify the project in there. I'm going to run this on silent mode because I just want to consider the analysis strictly in Revit. And you have the exact same options in here if you did want to filter out the different group options for the members. I'm going to just check off. Let's apply all general options to all the groups. Then we just go ahead and hit Analyze. And it's going to have pretty similar options again. It'll give you a list of all the products that have passed. If I click on a particular product, it'll give me the deflections, the bending ratios. So it'll give you a nice little summary in here. And again, you can individualize it per group if you want different product selections. I'm going to go ahead and just apply my selection to both groups. And then you're good to go. It'll update the model and bring in those families. And I'll just reiterate this in case it wasn't clear, but I haven't loaded in any sizes into my projects. I haven't had to load in any families. Based on the design results, it'll just load them in for you. And then I've got my product. So that's going to be it for me today. As Tanya mentioned, if there's any questions, feel free to go ahead now.
Perfect. Thank you, Christina. It looks like we have time to answer a few questions as she mentioned. If you'd like to pose a question live, please raise your hand now by clicking on the hand icon in the control panel. Just also please make sure that your audio is working correctly. While we wait for any questions to come through, I'd just like to remind everyone that the recording of the webinar will be sent through shortly after the session has closed. As always, if you'd like to share the recording with any colleagues, please feel free. All right, Christina, it looks like we have a few questions that came through the questions tab. This one's from Matthew. Can additional line and/or point loads be added to the analysis, or is it limited to uniform loads?
Good question. So I didn't actually add this in the model, but you do have the options to add in load cases with Revit. So you can add in point loads this way, line loads and area loads, and we'll actually be able to pick this up in the analysis as well.
Okay, awesome. We have got another one from Alex. Is it available to design one only joist and, for example, replace it with the beam in case if a joist is not applicable?
So if you only want to design a singular joist, because it breaks it up into groups, it does group everything that's identical under one group. So if you do have multiple members under the same group, it will do all of them in one go. The only thing I guess I could suggest is maybe to modify the floor panel, have it be just one joist if you wanted, and then you can run the analysis for that specific member alone. So I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly, but I hope that helps.
Okay, perfect. We'll just go ahead and answer just a few more questions that came through, Christina.
Sure.
This one is from Tim. Can you specify the hangers via Forte Web and Woodwork Sizer?
So the hangers aren't built directly into those engines, but we always do have the options of adding the hangers through the floor properties. So you can always come in here. Oops. There we go. So you do always have the option of coming in here and adding wood connectors this way. And it'll just load in the member types, and then just depending on which member to which member, it'll give you a list of available connections. So it is something that you can do regardless of analysis. And we are going to update the analysis. Right now it does just work for kind of simple dimensional lumber, but we will add it in eventually so you can add in the connectors.
Perfect. Just last question from Mark. Is there an analysis engine for open web joists?
Not for open web joists. We do have something on the light gauge side for just regular steel joists, but for wood, it is strictly reserved to these 3 engines and their products.
Okay, perfect. All right, that looks like that's a wrap for today. I know there's a few questions that haven't been answered yet. We'll make sure to get to them today. Once again, I just want to say thank you to Christina and also thank you to everyone who registered for the webinar. Just want to mention quickly to stay tuned. We'll be having a webinar next week, and we're going to be covering how to prepare your Revit model for MWF. All right, we'll now be ending the webinar. Thank you.